So it took me about 10 years after college, where I got a degree in computer science, to feel comfortable calling myself a designer. I'd been a computer nerd all my life. I spent my middle school weekends transcribing the basic code from computer magazines and computer programming books into my Apple IIe. Spending hours fixing the typos and then getting chills down my spine when I got it to work right. I spent my summers at computer camp, several of them. Not this one, but I wish. I wore thick glasses, which were not infrequently bandaged with tape, and I posed for things like this. Yeah, actually on Muppet Magazine. No. So I was obviously set for a life of engineering. Nothing had ever been more obvious. And at the same time, an alter ego of myself was secretly learning to appreciate and execute good design. This was the guy that over-designed his 6th grade history report, got accolades for great outlining skills from my teacher. He spent 3 years as the high school yearbook designer. And he was the designer of his college newspaper, for which the Society of News Design, for some foolish reason, gave him an award. And the first me started to notice the second me, and maybe even bestowed a measure of pride upon him. But like we said, we were growing up to be an engineer. It was too obvious. Designers knew about art, and they knew how to draw. And they talked about Joseph Mueller-Brockman, whoever he was. And I knew nothing about that stuff. I knew computers. And then a funny thing happened, the web. It was a new design medium, and it needed to be manned by code nerds in order to function at all. And then another funny thing happened. As I got new jobs, they started to have the word designer in the titles. Technical designer, site designer. Still, I was sure I was no expert. The real designers were my coworkers, who made up site designs out of whole cloth. A terrifying responsibility that I wanted nothing to do with. This is a real photo of my coworker. I have no idea why I made this, but I found it in my archives. Most of those people actually were the designers. Job after job went like this until I quit and started my own web design business, making websites out of whole cloth. 10 years had gone by, and one day I looked around and I thought, holy shit, that other me won. I guess I'm a designer now. Oh God, please don't tell anyone. It's like Molly was talking about. It's classic imposter syndrome. You know this idea, right? Where you're good at something, but you're deaf to all proof of it. You know there's some threshold of achievement for the role you want to play, and you just haven't met it yet. There's no way you've met it. Everyone else in that role is just so good. I always thought design was so deliberate, that there was a secret box of tools that designers earn from going to design school and having design friends and going through designer initiation rituals that probably included a recitation of the Pantone color wheel in a dark room surrounded by men in black turtlenecks with names like Halftone and Dr. Linotype. Of course, there is a box of tools, but it's not secret. These tools, like everything else, come from practice. And practice comes from stabs in the dark. And as an engineer, I rebelled against this for so long. I knew great design, I loved great design, but I thought, or at least desperately wished, that at some point someone was just going to tell me how to do great design. Wouldn't you know it, these are well-worn neuroses. Here's someone whose voice you may recognize talking about how he went through the exact same thing.
Nobody tells people who are beginners.
Can you hear this?
And I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple years when you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just like say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste. They could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, like I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?
Could you guys hear that? Okay, cool. I mean, you could read it too. I'm glad I picked the version with words. Right, so that was made by a guy named David Shang Liu, using an audio from a piece by Current TV, and obviously it was Ira Glass. So here's how I came to be okay with calling myself a designer. 3 big things I recognized. Design is order. When I visit a high school for career day, which I do from time to time, and I talk to students about a job doing design, I always ask, who considers themselves a designer? And generally about a quarter of the hands go up. And I'm talking to classes of people who are taking design classes, computer programming classes. Generally about a quarter of the hands go up. And what I tell these students, and what I'll tell you, is that every single one of you is a designer. Everyone you know is a designer. Designing is, as much as anything else, what makes us human. Design is nothing more than the attempt to make order out of chaos. What other creature attempts such folly at the scope that we do? Order begets structure. Structure begets predictability, which begets trust and comfort. We spend our lives weighing risk versus reward and attempting to reduce the former in favor of the latter. You know what they call the people who tip the scales in favor of humans? Designers. As a computer nerd, I didn't mingle with the art nerds. I had nothing to offer whatever it is they talked about at parties. And frankly, why would I want to go to a party anyway? That's where the extroverts hung out. So if design was an art and I was not an artist, I could not be a designer. Of course, design is not art, not always. Often it's craft. Now, design can be gorgeous. It can be magical. It can bring you to tears, which it does for me constantly. That's posters by a local guy named Rob Lukatka on the left, and a poster by poster designer Ollie Moss on the right. And I love these. And these are examples of great design. But what I do, interface design, it's a craft. It's the craft in the same way architecture is a craft, or plumbing is a craft. And this isn't news, but it took me a long time to realize it. Design is messy. I've made a lot of mistakes as a designer, and I continue to make them, and I would wager that at least 80% of them stem from my background and my mindset as an engineer. Engineers, myself very much included, are solutionists. We see everything in the world as a problem, and we see our tool set as the solution. And no question, this can be tremendously useful in some contexts. No small number of world problems have been solved by an overeager nerd with an idea. But visual and interface design doesn't work that way. Design problems don't have discrete solutions. This took me so long to realize, like, still not totally sure it's true. They don't even really have solutions. They have spectrums of, let's say, results, which range from more harm than good to more good than harm. Which means, and this hurts to say, but no single solution is going to be without at least a little bit of harm. The best we can do is keep it to a minimum. We're dealing with nature, the nature of human behavior. And when you dance with nature, you're never going to lead. The best you can do is embrace the uncertainty and try to keep up with the steps.
One thing is I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything, and there are many things I don't know anything about. But I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things, by being lost in a mysterious universe without having any purpose, which is the way it really is as far as I can tell, possibly. It doesn't frighten me.
That's physicist Richard Feynman, who knew a thing or two about the universe, but was still willing, compelled, in fact, to embrace uncertainty. But getting to Zen, of course, is no small mountain. Here's a few things that I've learned on my path. The faster you give up on perfection, the quicker you'll be done, right? And the sooner you move on to the next project. Too often, we let perfect be the enemy of the good. Well, every new project is a fresh start with new constraints and a new chance to use the skills you've honed in the last project. At the Starter League, where I work, shaping fresh-faced beginners into web design nerds, I teach a class every Monday and Wednesday afternoon. And every Monday and Wednesday morning, I sweat the plan for that day's class. And every Monday and Wednesday evening, I ride the L home, kicking myself over the ways it should have gone better. It could have gone better had I only planned better. That's the engineer. Well, this attitude has consequences, and not just good ones. Just 2 days ago, in class, we asked our students for class feedback. We call these retros. They're mildly structured and anonymous. Under the column of stop, as in stop doing this, someone wrote this. Nailed it. So the engineer in me is now being coached by the designer in me, and vowing to understand and not criticize, and use that understanding for betterment. There's this thing called the adjacent possible. Have you heard of this? Some of you? It's coined by a scientist named Stuart Kauffman, and it seeks to explain how successful inventions and world-changing ideas are always cumulative. How they can only exist thanks to the hundreds and thousands of smaller ideas that came before it. Author Stephen Johnson talks a lot about this, and he says, the adjacent possible is a kind of shadow future hovering on the edges of the present state of things. A map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. Good design is a mesh of ideas, combined through no easy formula, and the best way to get there is to expose yourself to as much influence as possible. Expect that 5% of it will be useful. But you won't find that 5% unless you're willing to wade through that other 95%. And it only comes with time. To make sure you're exposed to enough adjacently possible, you have to start early. That blank slate, that Photoshop document, it's the scariest thing in the world, right? And often we don't have enough constraints to force our hand. The longer of a runway you give yourself, the longer you'll have to stumble into the idea that's adjacent to your eventual creation. Get a junk drawer, a metaphorical junk drawer if you need, or a real one, an idea board, a moleskin, a field notes, anywhere you can slap down ideas and save them for later. Exposure to good ideas, just exposure is not enough. Your memory is not powerful enough to retain them all. Spend a few seconds every time you see something good and file it away. The act of filing, the very act of it, will make it easier to recall that item later. And you'll have a catalog of good ideas to rifle through when you need it. This is a picture from the internet. I would show you mine, but my handwriting's abhorrent. You wouldn't be able to make it out, which maybe is a good thing. Maybe I should have shown you. That's me. My day job is web design, but I also, on the side, I make puzzles. I have a blog with puzzles. And every year I put on a puzzle hunt for my friends. And this takes a tremendous amount of work because I usually have to come up with like 20, 25 puzzles that I eventually whittle down to the 11 or 12 that I'll include in the hunt. What eases the work is that I don't make these up in one go. I think about them constantly. And when I come up with something, I make an Evernote note. I tag it Puzzle Hunt, and then I forget about it until I need to start planning the hunt. And then I do the same, and then I have all those notes available to me. I do the same thing with articles I want to send to my students, ideas for a future talk, gifts for my wife. Offload the memory from your brain. It's not as robust as you think, even if you're Spock. Finally, though, I think we engineers have one big thing to bring to the table, and it's this: an understanding that design is about empathy. I know engineers are empathetic. I think so. And it gets back to what I was saying earlier. We have an understanding that when we engineer and when we design, we do it to make lives easier. And not just our lives, others' lives. Every pixel we place, every line of code we write, every structure we build, we do so because there is a human being on the other side, on the other end, whose life will improve because of it. If your design strategy contains nothing more than a conviction of that single tenet, then I think you'll be most of the way there. Thanks. I guess questions? Or lunch? Does anyone have a question? They all want to eat. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Still for a minute. So, so I love the spectrum that you had. You know, more good, more harm.
Good, yeah.
And so I'm not even sure what the question is. It's something around, do you design something and then try and figure out where it lives on that spectrum, or do you aim, I mean, obviously you want more good than harm. I guess, how do you evaluate your designs based on that spectrum or other spectrums that you have?
Well, I start with the spectrum. I mean, I would never start a design without thinking first if it's addressing a dominant use case. Like, it all starts with the empathy and an understanding of what the users, in the case of web design, the website users need, and then that informs the design decisions going forward. So at the very beginning, you're asking yourself, is this change it's going to help people? We know that because we're starting with a question of what needs help, or who needs help in what way. But is it going to hurt, is it going to hurt other people's experiences as well?
And then it almost goes back to your, forget about perfection.
Yeah.
How do you decide where on that spectrum to stop?
Right. So you'll drive yourself crazy trying to decide, or I should say, trying to evaluate before you create something what kind of good it's going to do. And so that gets to the point I was making about finish things quickly. Right. Don't strive for perfection. Just get it out there, and then make sure you have measurements in place tools in place to measure the kind of good that it's doing. It could very well be the opposite of what you think, and I think every designer would tell you that we're making guesses. We're taking stabs in the dark. Okay, so acknowledge that, and just make sure you have tools to measure it as soon as you make it live. And if you do it quick enough, if your cycle is iterative enough and agile enough, then you'll be able to push out changes, test them, and then change them quickly. If it turns out that you're doing the wrong end of the spectrum.
Great, thanks.
This gentleman.
Thanks. How do you teach your students empathy?
Well, I think the first step is to have them acknowledge that that's their measuring stick. And I think when you're not trained or when you don't have experience with design, which most of these students don't, right? I don't know if you guys know about the Starter League, but we are beginner-focused school, and so people come to us and they take classes from us to learn about web design and web development, and usually they don't have any background in the field. Sometimes they do, but usually it's like they're coming from another career or another specialty. And so I think at first there's no implicit understanding that it starts with empathy. I think they think of it as boxes and typography and color and shapes and stuff like that. And those, of course, are all tools to achieve the goal of addressing your users' needs, and you get to that answer through empathy. So empathy is where the starting point. Does that answer your question? More or less.
More or less. Yeah.
More or less. Okay, I'll take that. Maria.
So based on your past experience from a designer's perspective, what was sort of the biggest problem with communication between the designers and engineers and the developer side? And how did you guys resolve that?
Right. So Maria's question was, what was the biggest problem in communication between designers and engineers? Right. So in every block, it was a very, very small team. It's 5 people on the product team, 6 people at once and at one time. And so there wasn't a lot of problems because we were all together in one place. Now there was different mindsets and there certainly was strongly different opinions. But that's healthy, right? Because the worst thing a designer can have is an impression that they know all the right answers. And that if they're given full autonomy over the design decisions of the product, then you're not hearing from enough voices. But I also worked at companies where it was a lot bigger design department. And, you know, I don't have a great answer because my solution was to leave the company and go somewhere else. But yeah, the answer is small product teams, I think. I mean, small teams of people working together, blurring the lines between who's making the decisions about design. You know, at every block we like to practice collaborative design with everyone in the company, which is, again, it was a 10-person company total. It's like 5 or 6 people on product and then some other roles. But everyone was involved in design. Because design, like I said, it doesn't come from the wellspring of the designer's mind. The designer's a facilitator, like Peter was saying. Anyone else? All right, well, I'll be around if you have more questions. Thanks.